All right, let me also go across and try and make sense of this whole thing about gender fluidity and gender neutrality. What is cisgender, transgender? How can there be a person who is biologically a man but identifies as a woman? How can there be somebody who biologically is a woman but identifies themselves as a man? And then, of course, you have this whole business of pronouns, which frankly I don't understand, but Salvatore Babones does. He's an American sociologist. He's associate professor at the University of Sydney. Thank you very much, Professor Babones, for joining us. First things first, the argument, and I'm sure you're also following the fascinating arguments that are happening in the Supreme Court of India on legalizing same-sex marriages. The argument that's being put forth by the petitioners is that you are denying basic civil rights by way of marriage to a particular class of citizens because of their sexual orientation. Those same rights you're extending to heterosexual couples, and that is a violation of basic human rights, violation of the Indian Constitution, so on and so forth. Where do you stand, and how do you view this ongoing, not just legal debate that's happening in India, but this is also a sociological debate, I believe?
Well, of course, I can't weigh in on Indian legal affairs. I'm not a constitutional law expert, never mind an Indian constitutional law expert. Of course, thinking on this issue has evolved globally, and different countries have come to different solutions. But let's remember, here in Australia, same-sex marriage only became a nationally accepted norm in 2017, so less than 6 years ago. In the United States, it was 2015. So this is really new territory. Different countries have handled it differently. In the United States, same-sex marriage came in through a similar mechanism to what seems to be going on in India, that it was a Supreme Court decision on the basis of construed fundamental rights, and it was highly controversial. It was a 5-4 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, so it was by no means something that was a broad consensus. Instead, it was a very narrow majority. In Australia, by contrast, there was a referendum process, and the referendum won overwhelmingly. The referendum, the Australian citizens of Australia overwhelmingly supported the idea of gay marriage. And that's something we've seen in countries where it's been handled via referendum, or in individual U.S. states where it's been handled via referendum. Those states tended, or those countries have tended to approve the concept of same-sex marriage. In places where it has been imposed through judicial fiat, it has been highly controversial.
But during the course of the arguments, it seemed like the remit of the debate on legalizing same-sex marriage had been sort of expanded, if you will, where the Chief Justice went on to say that there is no concept of absolute man or absolute woman, and that gender cannot be defined by just male or female body parts. And I also understand that gender is also part biological construct and a part sociological construct. But are we now moving in a direction of extreme wokeism where, like I said in the earlier part of the program, on some days a person identifies themselves as male, and some days the person identifies themselves as female? Where are we headed with this, and how do we make sense of this?
Well, there was the odd phenomenon of the latest nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court being asked the simple question, can she define a woman? And she said, I'm not a biologist. Now, the funny thing is, for me as a sociologist, I thought she probably should have said, I'm not a sociologist, because our evolving definitions of gender and sexuality have little to do with biology and much more to do with sociology, which is how people choose to live in society. We can easily identify for almost everybody a clear sex in terms of chromosomal sex. People either have XX or XY chromosomes. There are a small number of people who have chromosomal abnormalities, where they have one is the aptly named triple X chromosome, which is a chromosome type that makes women appear extraordinarily feminine, and there are other chromosomal abnormalities. On top of that, there is the phenomenon of intersex appearance at birth, which means that even someone who has, say, an XX chromosome may develop aspects of male anatomical features, and vice versa, right? But these are very rare conditions. For most people, biologically, for most people, the vast majority of people, sex is not really at issue.
So then how do you frame this? Because like you said, I mean, there are now individuals, as few of them as they are, but there are individuals who may have been born with male sexual organs, who may have been born as a man, but they identify themselves as a woman. I mean, this opens up a whole can of worms in terms of, violence against women. A trans woman who identifies herself as a woman can use mitigating factor in a case of violence against women, or even for something as simple as entry into bathrooms, right? A trans woman can say that, I identify myself as a woman and therefore I need to get entry into a women's bathroom, which may be offensive to the other cis women who may be using that bathroom at that time. How do you make these distinctions?
Well, what we used to teach is that sex is a biological construct and gender is a social construct. However, transgender activists have increasingly insisted that no, in fact, gender is a biological construct. That is, the argument is that if the mind perceives the body as being, let's say, female, then the person is female, and the XY chromosome and the male genitalia are pathologies of what is truly a female sexual being. That's a novel interpretation. It's one that's only arisen in the last 10 years, but it is an interpretation that has a lot of power, persuasive power among certain communities. I can't say that it's false. All I can say is that it's novel. It's something new that people have started to claim that their gender identity is in fact their sexual identity, and the chromosomes and genitals are simply wrong. And ultimately, that's what the new transsexuality is all about. It's about correcting the genitals to match the psychological gender identity.
So, Professor Babones, are we then moving in a direction where someone who is born as a male with male biological organs but identifies themselves as female, or vice versa, is moving to biologically change their bodies? I mean, do we even know the entire gamut of medical research on this? How are you going to characterize this person, their gender, their relationships? A trans man who identifies himself as a woman in relationship with another woman, I mean, is that straight? Is that gay? How does society classify all of this?
Well, in a recent column, I actually called transgenderism the new conservatism, because in an odd way, it is an embrace of traditional sex roles. It's saying that if I'm behaving socially in a way that has traditionally been associated with the way women behave, then I must be a woman. And in a bizarre way, that's actually very conservative. It's the approach taken, for example, in Iran, where in Iran, homosexuality is illegal. But if you have gender reassignment surgery, you can convert yourself from a man into a woman, and then you can live and marry a biological man. Because you have now become a woman. It's this strange embrace of an extraordinarily conservative idea of gender and sexuality. Of course, all of this is at the very frontiers of human rights thinking and legal thinking. I don't have the answers, but nor do the activists have the answers. So, for example, in countries like Ireland and in Scotland, where governments have until recently embraced without question, passed laws that made it absolutely unquestionable, a person could set that, people could set their own gender identities and sex identities on official documents by choice. And of course, in both countries, the inevitable happened, which was that male rapists identified as women in order to be admitted to women's prisons. Everyone knew that was going to happen. All skeptics said that, yet the governments nonetheless went through with these policies. And then the respective prime ministers or first minister in the case of Scotland had to backtrack on these and say, well, that's true most of the time, but not in these problematic cases. And, we've seen sports federations initially be very affirming about transgender, as long as it was a very small issue, a very tiny number of athletes, they could affirm those athletes in their decisions. But once it became widespread in swimming, especially, and now in athletics, where in some athletics competitions, we've seen all three of the top three female winners be trans women, now there's a lot of pushback against it. And of course, that was inevitable. I mean, anyone who really took a dispassionate look at this issue would have told you that this problem is going through, this challenge, let's call it, is going to arise. How society solves these challenges, I don't know, but the challenges are certainly there.
So 10 years down the line, how do you see society accepting gender? There was a time when gender was just male and female, and then we added a third gender, right? How is gender going to be viewed and defined and even accepted a decade from now?
Well, transgenderism of some form has always existed. It's always existed in Western societies, and my understanding is that it's always existed in India as well. So the fact of transgenderism is not new. It's the societal embrace of transgenderism that is something that we're now wrestling with. I don't know how it will end up. We live in highly gendered societies. If we didn't, say if there were no separate competitions for men and women, if there were no separate prisons, if there were no separate bathroom facilities, that is, if we didn't recognize gender, then this would cease to be an issue. And in some environments, we don't recognize gender. For example, admissions to universities are not based on gender quotas generally. I know there's some special programs for women, but in general, we don't say they're two separate categories. Yet for Best Actor and Best Actress, we have two separate awards. So we have different areas of society in which we recognize gender and some areas where we don't. How that balance will shift over the coming years, I can't say. I think I would caution people against assuming a unilinear flow of history, because there has been, once the problems associated with embracing all transgender choices, once those problems became clear, there have been societal backlashes in societies that were most advanced in embracing them. Where the compromise will end, I can't tell you, but I can assure you there will be some kind of compromise. It won't be all in one direction or all in the other.